Desegregating schools was a key goal of the civil rights movement. The first big win for the movement was the Brown v. Board of Education case. In 1951, Linda Brown's father sued the State School Board of Topeka because of their segregation policies in the school district. This was the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education. On May 17, 1954, the case came to an end when the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal schools cannot be equal and therefore are unequal. The court's decision made any segregation in schools unconstitutional. Just over a year after the end of the Brown v. Board of Education case, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. She is arrested for this because of segregation laws. This starts the Montgomery bus boycott, and on December 5, 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. is elected to lead the boycott. When the boycott ended in 1956, all Montgomery buses were fully integrated. Shortly after the boycott, many other nonviolent protests came up and were used to desegregate other places such as libraries, parks, pools, theaters, and other public places. On February 1, 1959, 4 African American men went to a white-only cafe and sat at the counter waiting to be served. They were denied service and sat in the cafe until it closed. This started sit-ins in many other cafes and restaurants. At one of the sit-ins, Martin Luther King Jr. and 51 other protesters were arrested for trespassing. Just 6 months after the first sit-in, cafes started to change their policies on serving African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was a federal voting rights bill. It was the first occasion since Reconstruction that the federal government undertook significant legislative action to protect civil rights. The act empowered federal prosecutors to obtain court injunctions against interference with the right to vote. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Over 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The march was successful in pursuing the administration of John F. Kennedy to initiate a strong federal civil rights bill in Congress. MLK also gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In his speech, he called for an end to racism in the United States and called for civil and economic rights.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
After the march, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders met with President Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House, where they discussed the need for a bipartisan support of civil rights legislation. After President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. continued to press for the bill, as did the newly inaugurated President Lyndon B. Johnson. On July 2, 1964, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law, with King and other civil rights leaders present. The law created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to address race and sex discrimination in employment and community relations services to help local communities solve racial disputes. It also authorized federal intervention to ensure the desegregation of swimming pools, parks, schools, and other public facilities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 illegalizes all discriminatory voting requirements, such as literacy tests before registering to vote. On April 4, 1968, MLK goes out onto the balcony of his motel room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, and he is assassinated by James Earl Ray. After having led the civil rights movement for over a decade, using emotional speeches and nonviolent protests to fight segregation and achieve notable civil rights advancement for African Americans, King's assassination resulted in a surge of anger among African Americans and a period of national mourning. Just 7 days after MLK's death, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act. It prohibited discrimination regarding the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, sex, or national origin. The Fair Housing Act was the final great legislative achievement of the civil rights movement. The Fair Housing Act put an end to all legal segregation, and it marked the end of the civil rights movement.